I've created another Photoshop file to show our new 4 primary ecosystem layers. And I have them laid out and colorized, overlaying on top of each other with a couple of different blenders. As you can see, the 4th layer is underneath the 3rd and set up with a difference blender where we have linear dodge add set to 3 and 2 with number 1 set to normal. This way we can take a look and see our distribution for our overall population, and this is from the further back camera. So you can use this file. It's called 4 primary eco layers, and go through to help plan out which plants you want to have in each area. Now, number 3 and 4 are going to be very similar. The one difference is layer 4 has a lot more distribution. It doesn't have a fractal tied to it. It is just the environment tab settings. So it stretches a little bit lower and covers some of the areas that the 3rd one doesn't. Keep in mind too that these distributions are not going to be exact, or they don't have to be exact, because we can use the affinity and repulsion from layer. So the way we set these layers up in view can also be important. And we'll take a look at those settings as we're starting to apply our plants to the ecosystem. Basically, one of the settings is to populate our vegetation or objects closer to or away from the layer underneath it. So the way we position and layer and set up the order for these ecosystem layers that we have can end up being really important. So you can load this in, use it as a reference, and it's a good idea just to have something like this on hand so that if you run into any problems, you can take a look at it overall and maybe help break down an issue, or even just the overall decision of where things are going to go. And I made this the same way I did with our other layers, just creating black and white versions. And then in this case what I did was just set the hue and saturation, set it to colorize, and then I was able to change the color. If you also take a look at the overall distribution, these purple areas are just the water that's set up. So you could either remove them or keep them in there. I know it's the water, so it's not going to be a big issue. But if you are giving this reference maybe to someone else on your team, you might want to fill those in with black, or you could render out a version of the terrain and the alpha. By default, the water will show up as white. So then what you could do is just invert it and multiply it on top of all of these, and that will make the water areas black. And using this reference, we can now pick a new zone to set up to populate the ecosystem. And what we're going to look for is an area where there's a lot of mixing and matching between the different ecosystem layers. We also want a good bit of elevation and be able to use the decayer for foreign objects if possible. So if we take a look, it looks like this area just around here is a very good distribution of all 4 layers. And if we need to, we can move the zone over into that kind of pond lake area where we had our zone before, and then be able to test and adjust our decay near foreign objects. But for the most part, that setting looked like it was working pretty good when we were testing it with the maple trees, and it doesn't look like we're really going to need to run any more tests with that unless we start working on smaller plants for a much closer view of the scene. So right now, this population zone is going to be our best bet, and the best way to really see what each of the layers look like. Now, this zone itself is going to be huge, and if we were to populate this, we're going to end up with a lot of actual ecosystem objects, so it might be a little bit too large. So what we can do is just kind of condense, maybe go to a smaller area. So it looks like maybe just in between these two water areas, and maybe a little bit over to the left. We could also make it a little bit smaller, and we can always move around the zone as well. But we do want to pick something that maybe we won't be moving the zone around too much, just because we did run into those issues before, where we had the zone not updating and the density wasn't correct. So in View, I have loaded in the zone scene we're working on, and I'm just going to select our Zone 1 control and just move it over to that area where the distribution looked like it was pretty close to having just about everything, and we can see the two bodies of water, the one on our left and on the right, being the top and bottom ones from our reference. So go ahead and just scale this down just a little bit, and this should be a good starting point. There's not a whole lot of elevation, but this will give us a good idea of all four layers, and we can set up which species we're going to have in each zone. So I'm going to save a new file, and you might see a couple of different scene files in here from stuff I was working on outside of the recorded part of the training. And this was the large zone and the material eco, and that was just for rendering out those four layers we just saw in Photoshop. And then of course some of my versions of the vegetation pics when I was renaming all the materials. So we can select our landscape, edit the material, and we have those four population layers. Right now we just have the maple tree assigned to all of them. So if you want a really quick preview of what this zone looks like, you can repopulate all of these different layers, and you could also use that to adjust the distribution settings for the affinity with layer and repulsion from layer, which is what I was talking about before, either populating close to the layer below or away from it. This is only going to work with more than one ecosystem layer, and it applies to the layer that's underneath, although populates on the selected layer. So it'll use whichever population you have from the layer underneath it to populate. And now we can populate all of these zones. And it looks like there was nothing showing up for number 4 or number 3. So we might need to change the position of our zone in order to get that population showing up, because we do want to work with those layers. So what we can do is go back to our reference image and maybe see if there's a closer spot we can work with. And what I'm going to do is, I think there was a little bit over M or the Z. If we just move our zone control, and we're not seeing the terrain update, and that might be because of the ecosystem that is populated on here. So I'm going to right mouse click with the landscape selected, edit the object, let that refresh, And now we can go back into the material and repopulate, and hopefully it will recognize the new position of the zone. And it looks like it did, so we'll just go ahead and populate all 4 of these layers once again and see if we can get something showing up for number 3. And if it shows up for 3, it should show up for 4. Yep, and it looks like we're just starting to see a little bit of that zone. It also looks like we might have a little bit of a scale difference between these, so I'm going to check our overall scaling and just make sure they're all set to 0.2, and they are. It's just that number 4 and 3 look like maybe they're populating the instances too low, but in this case the maple tree is a very versatile tree. It will create many different size variations, and that could just be part of it. Just want to make sure there's nothing connected to the variable scaling instead of the density. So we have a little bit of 3 and 4 showing up over here, and then we have number 2 and 1 on the rest of the terrain. So we have a good working zone for all of our ecosystem layers, and now we can start to plan out the actual ecosystem we're going to be using. And I did find that in order to keep the population correct for moving the zone, that instead of clearing our ecosystem, we can remove our layers. Now if you're working on part of the ecosystem with the actual vegetation or objects you have, then maybe that might not be the best idea. In most cases, you can save the scene, close view out, reopen it. Since we're working with the zone and it's a really light scene on the memory, it'll load very quickly and you won't have to worry about any problems there. So now that we know that this works, I'm going to save a new version. Number 11, and I'm going to give this an underscore ecopop, just to separate those and that from the other versions we're going to create, and just to give a starting point within the sequence so we know when we're starting to really work on the ecosystem. We'll go ahead and open up our material. And we're going to start with the lowest layer, which is going to be population 1. Also keep in mind too that we are not going to be restricted to these 4 layers. We can add on other layers and use the affinity with layer and repulsion in order to match up or away from our current densities. So there's a lot of flexibility there. If we add in plants, I've already gone ahead and added in all of my variations. Now there's one thing you're going to notice, and that is all of the leafless trees, or the dead trees, are a little messed up. And basically, from what I found, these trees themselves are crashing view and not showing up correctly. It could be part of changing the materials, because I did condense all the materials, if there was more than one bark material, down into one. So it was just one material on the entire plant, and it looks like it did cause a few issues with my custom variations of the dead trees. So in this case, what I'm going to end up doing is just using the dead trees that come with view, because I do want to make sure there are some trees without any leaves on them, just to make the scene keep it realistic. And we're working with layer 1, which covers almost the entire terrain. It also has some really nice fine detail for our distribution. So it's important that we don't load it up with plants that have a whole bunch of polygons, because some of the plants, if we go over into the trees section, it is suggested by Eon that you do not use them for ecosystems because they are very intensive on the memory, because they have so many polygons. the large European ash, is about 450,000 polygons. And one of the trees that I'm using is one of those higher polygon trees, which is the alder. I do like to use some of those within the ecosystem. Being really far away from the ecosystem, it won't really matter if you're using these really high resolution trees as far as visually. They'll look about the same as the maple from really far away. So I do want to make sure I'm not using any of those on the really large populated areas. And we're going to stick with some of the variations from the more reduced polygon plants. And that would be the maple, but we can always throw in some of the smaller amounts of the higher resolution trees, so maybe using a less presence within the density. So for this, I want to select some of our maple variations, because we are going to be working with such a large area in this one. And the plum tree is also a very quick loading, quick rendering tree, which is going to be good from far away, although it is a bit smaller. One thing to keep in mind. And we'll be taking a look at a scale reference for all of the native trees. And that way we can compare our scale, and it'll help us really figure out what needs to go where. The scale reference, although available with the training, can also be found in the free stuff page of the asileFX website. And the entire scaling chart is listed here, and can also be downloaded in a couple of different formats. I've also got the last updated version of it listed, and that way you can download the newest version of it. It's a very easy reference to use and very helpful. As you can see, it has every single tree, which collection it's from, and the solid growth variations, which is the width min and max and the height minimum and maximum. It also has these subsets for the trunk and branches and the leaves and petals, and then also the wind and breeze options. So you can use this to make scale comparisons between the species, and that way you don't have to keep adjusting the scale and messing around with it in order to figure out what works. So just with these three right now, I'm going to go ahead and just populate, and we can take a look. I'm going to be adding a lot more to the ecosystem population, having a lot more variation and variety of the plants. But I just want to see so far how this is looking. And as you can see, that plum tree is really small. Now what we can also do is set up a full quality near camera. For this, I am going to move the camera away from the landscape. The reason for this is, depending on the scale you have set as your default for the full quality near camera option, we wouldn't want too large of a radius already being set and to have all of these trees show up in full quality, because that is going to create a huge lag on the system, and it might be a while before you get any sort of a display back within view. Right now it's set to 20 meters, which is way too low, but we should be able to start seeing some trees show up once we get a little closer. So it looks like I do need to raise the radius, and whenever you're increasing the radius, it's a good idea to move away from the landscape. You can also see that you cannot set the full quality near camera option for individual layers in the version of View that I'm using, which is 7.2. Whether or not it's been changed with future versions, is something you'll have to test and see yourself. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 70 meters, just because that should be more than enough for what we need, maybe a little bit more, but it's a good idea to be away from the terrain when you're doing that in case you go too high, and that way you don't have to worry about everything refreshing. So we can go ahead and move in to this zone. And keep in mind that range is also affecting behind the camera and not just in front of it. So it is a radius around the camera. So even your ecosystem plants behind the camera are showing up even though you can't see them, which is kind of a drawback. So you will have to keep that in mind. If you have a very large density population behind the camera that you're not going to be seeing and only a few in front, it may be better just to look at it from a different angle. So now we have a good preview of our current plants. And we can take a look at the different layers this way, using the full quality near option. If your system is able to process all of these different trees, it will really slow down the system just because it's using the actual polygon value rather than just the images that show up as 2D planes to represent the instances. But it is a good way to preview our ecosystem, and we can see some very nice variations as well. One thing I like to use this for, even if I'm showing the entire ecosystem in full quality, which can also be done. If we take a look under the settings, we have a default quality. If you set that quality to smooth shaded or wireframe, any of the options other than billboard, except maybe wireframe box and filled box, which then they'll just show up as boxes. But the smoothly shaded mode will set all of the instances to look like the full quality near camera ones, which makes them all full quality instead of these billboards, which is currently showing up. So sometimes, even though I'm using that option, I like the billboard because it does cut away in the middle of the ecosystem, which lets you see a little bit better some of the height variations that it might be difficult to see without them being cut away. So right now we can see some nice areas popping in and out, and you get a better sense of the height of the ecosystem vegetation or objects that you have within the layer by using this option. And I'm going to go back and just turn this down a little bit because I am having a little bit of system lag just because I'm recording this while I'm actually doing it. Bring it down to 40, and maybe we'll bring that up to 50, just to start getting some of that tree line in the front. And we can add in some more objects to this layer. And I'm going to turn down our density setting as well, because we do want the density to be partially controlled by our variable density. So not just the overall fractal, but some of the differences in between the fractal, and not just filling it up entirely. And I also want to throw in some conifers as well. And most of the conifer species, except the fir tree, are going to take a little longer to load than some of the other plants within view, which means they are also a higher polygon amount. And that's just something to keep in mind, is some of the instances will behave and make your system behave a little slower than others, and also take a little bit longer to load them in. Now we can see clearly right now we have a huge scale change for our conifer species, so we will need to reduce their scale because they are more than twice the height of our other objects. Now, granted, we do want them to be higher, but maybe not this high. And even in the billboard mode, that is pretty clear. So I'm going to bring this down to 0.5 for our scale, and we can start to bring that down. And right now I just have a very even distribution throughout the scene. All of these have the same amount of presence, so basically the same amount of them within the amount of space given. And we can see that looks a little bit better. You could even start doing some test renders if you want to. And I'm not going to be covering in too much detail the distribution settings and going into it too much, explaining all of the features. But there is one thing I haven't really covered in any previous training, so I do want to cover it now, and that is the driving the distribution with a function. What this will do is set the presence for all of our ecosystem populations and different objects we have in there based on this whatever setting or fractal we'd like to use. Images, in this case, I'm going to be connecting it to the same as our density. What that's going to do is create sort of a layered effect and a ring effect around our different distribution areas based on the number of the density. So I'm just going to show you that right now. Clicking Drive with Function, which will open up the function editor, and I'm going to connect this distribution to our filter. Click OK. And right now we can see it hasn't done anything. You will see a number showing up when this is properly connected. The reason it's not working right now, and whether or not it's a bug with the current version, I'm not sure. But what I'm going to do is remove one of our ecosystem population objects. Let's do plum number 2. And now we can see all the presence values have refreshed. And I'm going to add the plant back in where we had plum number 2. And now that is working correctly. What it's automatically done is set a number range for each of the plants. So you may have to plan this out a little bit better in which order you set them up in order to get this to look exactly the way you want it to. I'm going to go ahead and populate it right now with what I currently have set up, and you're going to be able to see how this distribution option works because it can be very useful for populating ecosystems. So now what we can see is that we have sort of that ring effect, and our fractal we have set up for the distribution looks like it may be oversampling a little, which is why we have so many of these smaller plants on the inside. But what it's going to do is take the high number and assign that to the bottom population items where we have 0.6 to 1, which is the number value of the highest point of a fractal, or the white areas, and it slowly steps its way down into the black areas going through our distribution. So that's why it creates that ring effect, because we are using the density in order to control that. Now if we want to use something other than density, which in this case I do, I want to create a nice distribution of plants but not have it connected. And just to get that refresh, once again, I'm going to remove that plum, re-add it. So sometimes you just need to get it to refresh. And because I am going to be reconnecting this, I probably should have just waited on adding that. So I'm going to just remove it right now, drive it with a function, remove the constant node, And I'm having a little bit of a problem where I'm deleting this and it is closing out the function. So what I'm going to do is just cancel the function, go into our density setting, and this way any modifications we make to this shouldn't close out the function editor. So we could drive this with a fractal if we want. And I'm just making a duplicate of the density right now, just to get a sense of the scale that we have. Bring down the wavelength, set our metascale to 50, the largest feature to 9, increase our roughness a little bit, and connect our distribution to that, setting it to the altitude amount. I also want to make sure, by opening the function node preview, that we have a good amount of range between the 0 and 1 value, and we don't, which is probably why we had so many of the same instance showing up before. So we can adjust our gain in order to really make sure we're falling in between those values. Reduce roughness a little, increase that gain. And you could add a filter if you want. But the higher areas are going to be the plum, and I do want maybe less of those. So we'll add back in the plum tree. And in this case, it only updated the one presence. We're going to go ahead and populate and just see if it'll show up anyway. And it might not be applying to all of the objects, because what we should see is more clustering of the plants. But it does look like we do have some of these different trees that are similar being close together. If we take a look at the conifers, how they're kind of grouped up, it does look like maybe that present setting is being applied to that fractal. So this is just a nice way to distribute your ecosystem. You can create a quick preview render if you want to. And the first render you make with the procedural terrain is always going to be the longest until those polygons are calculated. Every render after that, provided the camera isn't moved too far outside that area, those renders will go much quicker. At this point, what we could also do is go back to the method we were using before, where we converted to a standard terrain since we are farther away. But that will affect some of our elevation settings we have in the environment tab. So it's just kind of something you want to keep in mind. So we can see a nice little preview showing up of our current ecosystem, and take a look and see if we want to change any of the distribution options, maybe the scale settings, swapping out some of the plants with some other ones. Since the maple trees look so similar, we do want to have some more variations. We might remove some of the different ones we've set up, keeping in mind they will sort of cluster together with that present setting, with a distribution being controlled by the fractal. I might want to change the overall scaling as well. This does look a little large for what I had intended, so we might need to bring down the overall scaling or reduce the scale on each individual plant, which sometimes is easier because once you get too low with the overall scaling, it becomes difficult to work with the ecosystem if they're too small. It could also throw off the decay near foreign objects and some of the other settings we have connected to that distribution.